Hello and welcome to another album analysis. In today's video we're looking at the newest album Glorious Sunset by the British alt-rock band 100 Reasons. This is the band's 5th studio album and their first in 16 years. It was 2007 when they did release Quick the Word, Sharp the Action, an album that really people weren't overly fussed on despite the band having a really strong start to their career with their 2002 album Ideas Above Our Station. It really was an album that set a fire under a lot of other up-and-coming bands that were really trying to get into the rock scene in the UK, and the band served as almost a trendsetter in really enabling rock to come to the charts, as it did quite heavily in the mid-2000s. And the band never really ever called it quits after Quick the Word, Sharp the Action. They have been kind of playing these one-off gigs every so often, really trying to get back together, but the songwriting just wasn't there. But eventually, over the past couple of years, it finally began to click, and the band really started to come back together and really start to work on the album, and this would be the result. Despite the heavy number of years since the previous album, the band have certainly refined their sound, maintaining the things that made them ever so popular: the passionate vocals from Colin Doran, the almost soaring grooves that they did like to throw into a lot of their music, and really emphasising this idea, these feelings of triumph and hope. And two other things that really do come with time are wisdom and experience, and I think we're going to see that on this album. They've certainly shown it throughout some of the singles they have released, and they've really matured their sound and really refined and honed it with the kind of wisdom they've gained over the years. So will this album prove to be a glorious sunset or a dismal sunrise? Let's take a look at it track by track. We do open with the title track Glorious Sunset, which opens with a shaker just to really shake you into action, prepare you for the forthcoming album. It does have a really nice quick pace to the start, and straight away we're introduced to these soaring vocals that Colin has used time and time again throughout his time with the band. And this song is very smartly placed on the album, because although it has actually changed meanings throughout the writing process, initially it seemed like the sort of track that was about a cruel lover, the end of a relationship. So it's that glorious sunset. You've been in a rough relationship and you've really gone and moved on, you've kind of got this glorious sunset, you're finally moving on to bigger and better things. However, due to one of the band members suffering the loss of a loved one from cancer, the song really did flip the meaning. It's this idea of the death of a loved one, and we see this through some of the lyrics. I wish I could beat you for the poison you are. And it's not talking to a person, it's talking to cancer. It's almost the Colin talking to this cancer saying, I wish I could beat you because you are poisoning somebody that I love, and then they do go on to pass on. So really emotional track, but it could also tie into this idea of the band being away for so long in the form of a glorious sunset. Maybe it feels like their last hurrah, maybe this will be the last album the band ever put out, but it's just that idea, if you've got a sunset which signifies the end of something, but it wants to be glorious, so it could be the end of the band, but they're kind of having one last hurrah before they do fade into the sunset. Then we do head into New Glasses, which has this very strong rhythmic intro. The guitar really does help to give it a good swing, and we have got a lot of repetition in the lyrics, this constant use of again, and it links to this idea of constantly doing the same thing. And this is a track revolving around the idea of treating people badly. One of those people that no matter what you do, they're just going to treat you negatively, and they do that to everybody around them. They keep doing it again and again and again, and eventually it does come back to hopefully bite them. And we've also got one trick on this song that I absolutely love that the band have done on previous albums, and it's some beautiful layering of vocals from Larry and Colin. It is one of their signature trademarks, and it's really distinguishable because Colin has very distinctive vocals, but so does Larry, and when they intersperse the two, it really does give off a great effect, and it was something I was really glad to see making a reappearance on this album. Then for track 3 we do have It Suits You, which has a much heavier feel to it. It's almost a snarlier vocal style from Colin, and this track feels like it touches on the idea of an imbalanced relationship. It was the even keeled that made us happier back then, so this idea that one person's not putting in as much as somebody else, and it's actually about maintaining positivity in a world of negativity. So we have got this idea of balance really being brought in, so there's different couple of ways that you can look at it, and it's got more great layering of vocals. It's something they do so brilliantly on this album. They really know when to just bring it in, to just give it some extra effect to a track. And again, we've got a lot of messaging on this album, really revolving around different ideas, different concepts, but a lot of it does tend to really build in this idea of relationships between people. It's something the band really did seem to focus on with this album. Next, we're heading into track 4, which is Replicate. Now, this is possibly arguably one of the strongest tracks the band have written in their entire career. It's a beautiful piece of music, really bringing in this soft piano open. It is a beautiful track that makes great use of strings and other orchestral elements, and at first I thought it was about a destructive lover, but it's actually this idea of not being good enough for your partner. So it is a little bit of a love song, and it's just a great way that the band have really pulled this together. They've occasionally dipped their toes into softer tracks, but they've really honed that skill on this one, really just building up this strong ending to the track later on, almost like this idea of running down a tunnel. Just this build, and it ties in so nicely with the lyrics, and it really just adds a lot of metaphor and a lot of meaning to the actual track itself. So this idea that you're constantly chasing to be good enough for somebody, and the tunnel just feels endless, and you try to reach the light at the end of it, and sometimes it can just be completely blacked out and you can't actually reach it. Heading to the midpoint in the album, we do have Done at track 5, which is this real change in vocal sound. It gives it a much more 2000s feel to it, just almost tying back to their early career, to that kind of sound. And it was really interesting to see this sudden mix up, because they have played with lots of different ideas on the album, and it talks heavily about struggling on the inside when you just really can't feel like you can be open and express yourself to somebody, and sometimes how people around you can see that. So again, another track with very, very heavy meaning, and something very interesting to see them trying to have a bit of a stab at some of an earlier sound compared to what we did see on previous albums. Then we do have Right There With You, which has a much slower, more sluggish style intro on the guitars and the drums, and we do see these switching vocals from Colin really dancing all over the place, which is really great to see that he's still able to emulate that style. And this is a song about sticking with somebody through tough times, and this applies to the band. I mean, they've had a lot of ups and downs, yet they've stuck together and produced another album, and I'm sure everybody goes through that, whether it be with people, with just things that happen in life. It's a very easy song to relate to. It talks about ghosts and things like that, and we have these haunting guitars in the later verses that really do help to build into this really great idea. And then we do get this again, this build into a guitar solo and a controlled scream, which certainly has much more power to it than what we did see on previous albums. It's not quite as heavy as songs such as the Shredder, but it just adds a nice touch just to really show they are kind of linking back to some of their roots with some of their earlier music, and showing how they've adapted and adjusted themselves over time. Then for track 7 we do have Insultament, which is actually a kind of combination of an insult and a compliment, and this was the track on the album that really caught me off guard. If it wasn't for Replicate, this would be the strongest song on the album, because it does try something slightly new. We've got much darker tones, very grungy with soft vocals. It's a really interesting contrast that I really didn't see coming from the band, and it's about somebody who's very negative and constantly blames others, and they eventually end up burning bridges. So we can see why it's got these much darker tones really thrown into it as well. And I really love these dark synth sounds that we've got over softer tones. It's such a contrastive track that really does make it very, very interesting on the ears. It's not something we've really seen from the band before, and it's showing something new, which I really wasn't expecting to hear, but they pulled it off so immaculately. Next up we do have So Soon, which has this really interesting distorted guitar to open, almost like something you'd hear on an early Silversun pickups track. And it's a track I thought initially was about putting down friends, really bullying your friends, but it's actually about the mistreatment of people with disabilities. So again, very heavy meaning being thrown into these tracks. The band have really pulled out all the stops in the songwriting and making sure that every track is just jam-packed, full of meaning, full of messaging, and they convey that very well through the lyrics. We do also have some more switching between Colin and Larry on vocals. They haven't used on every track, but on the tracks that they have, it becomes really noticeable. But I suppose it's one of those things, if they used it on every single song, it wouldn't have that same power. So they've really tried to throw it on some of the tracks that they really need that extra bit of strength, and just really to kind of show what they are capable of with that switching vocal style, because of them both having very noticeable vocal tones. Heading to the later stages now, and we do have The Old School Way, which initially I thought was a Blink-182 track. It has that very similar sound, again throwing back to a bit of a early 2000s style with the opening to this track, and it has these very strong rhythmic guitars, again really, really strong in the way that we're able to build a lot of melody into a lot of this track. And it's certainly got a very strong last two verses as well, has a lot of sway to it, and this is a song all about the idea of not taking responsibility for your actions. I'm sure everybody knows someone that just does that. No matter how much they're in the wrong, it's never their fault, and they just refuse to take blame. time. So they really are taking a stab at lots of different things on this album with the messaging, and they do it so very well because every single track, it's very easy to see what they're trying to convey and the messages they are trying to get across. Then to round out the album, we do have Waveform, which is the return of these grungier guitars, and it feels like it links as well to the band almost returning after a very long time away. It's quite interesting how the first and last song on this album, although they have very different meanings, they still emulate this idea of the band kind of going away for a long time and then making a return. It's just one of those that's sort of integrated into the tracks without actually trying to force that idea. They're actually focusing on something else. And this is a song all about, well, it felt like periodic variance, but it's actually about dealing with anger, about losing somebody close. So again, it could be that kind of push and pull with a person that you're really close with, you kind of lose touch over time, then you get back together and all of a sudden you kind of maybe see each other a few times in a very short space of time and the cycle repeats. Or it could be that idea of losing somebody close permanently and having these unresolved issues that you're not able to discuss, and you're kind of living with that guilt that is kind of just resting on your shoulders because of the last thing you said to somebody. Overall, I do feel this is a very, very strong album. It's certainly a great return to form for the band. I mean, it's got everything I'd expect to hear from them. Passionate vocals, some really big grooves, feeling of triumph and hope built into a lot of the tracks, despite touching on some more negative aspects, and also the bouncing of the vocals between Larry and Colin and occasionally overlapping. It's something that they do so very well, and I think this is a timeless album. Although the band haven't really released music for kind of so long, it's amazing how well this fits in today's world and occasionally bounces back to this old school sound. They've really done justice with a lot of the experience that they are really showing on this album, and I'd argue that this is probably the best album the band have written. I'd argue it's probably better than Ideas Above Our Station because every track just feels so polished, feels so clean, and is jam-packed full of meaning. And for those reasons, I'm going to give the album a very impressive 9 out of 10. I absolutely love this album. I just love the mix of sounds. The only thing you could maybe fault it on is there are a couple of points where it does feel maybe a tiny bit flat, but I'm really being picky with this album. I feel like every track in its own right is not a filler. I think they've managed it perfectly, sticking it to just 10 tracks. It really feels like the right length for covering the topics they want to cover, making a return to form, and really showing how the band have evolved over time. And I think this is definitely be one of the strongest albums we will see this year. It really is. If you've never heard these guys before, please give this album a listen because it's just got so much built into it that certainly does make it a very impressive album. So that will be everything for today's video, but as always, please do give the album a listen. Let me know your thoughts on what you think about it, or let me know what your favourite track is. I mean, for me, Replicate with Unsultament is a very strong second. I think they're two of the strongest tracks on this album, but it just doesn't feel like there's any tracks that really have that drop in quality or don't feel like they belong, or certainly feel like fillers. So I'm very, very impressed with what the band have put onto this album, and I certainly, if they can keep the quality like this, I hope it is not going to be their last. And as always, if you want to see more content like this, then please do feel free to subscribe, and I will see you in the next album analysis.